The heavy steel door of the secondary screening room slammed shut, cutting off the chaotic hum of the terminal. Inside, Officer Harlan Tate smiled, convinced he had just caught a family of smugglers trying to use fake VIP credentials. He reached for the sealed leather bag, ignoring the calm, chilling warning from the father. Tate had absolutely no idea he was seconds away from committing a federal crime, destroying his career, and triggering an international diplomatic crisis. The air inside the international terminal was thick with the distinct, exhausting energy of international travel. It was early afternoon on a humid day, and a sea of weary passengers from newly arrived wide-body jets were slowly shuffling toward the sprawling labyrinth of customs and border protection. Among the thousands of exhausted travelers was the Hale family. Dr. Julian Hale didn't look like a man who had just spent many hours in the air. Dressed in a sharply tailored navy blue Brioni suit, his posture was immaculately straight, his expression calm and focused. Walking beside him was his wife Eleanor, a woman whose quiet elegance commanded the space around her. She wore a simple, structured beige trench coat over a black turtleneck, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. Trailing slightly behind them was their teenage son, Caleb. Unlike his parents, Caleb looked exactly like any other American teenager, headphones resting around his neck, a vintage oversized hoodie, and a look of profound boredom as he texted on his phone. But Julian Hale was not an ordinary traveler, and his family was not subjected to the grueling, long wait in the General Customs line. Julian was a high-ranking envoy for a sovereign Caribbean coalition and a senior diplomat assigned to the United Nations. In his right hand, secured to his wrist by a discreet steel cable, he carried a heavy, reinforced leather satchel. Over the zipper, thick red wax had been stamped with an official government seal. It was a diplomatic pouch, and under international law, it was considered the sovereign territory of his home nation. It could not be opened, delayed, or X-rayed by any foreign government. Following the overhead blue signs, Julian guided his family away from the thousands of winding switchbacks and toward the designated diplomats and business travel lane. The lane was completely empty, a fast track designed to move foreign dignitaries through the border in a matter of minutes. Standing nearby, leaning against a podium near the exit of the primary screening area, was CBP Officer Harlan Tate. Tate was a veteran of the agency, a man whose thick neck and tightly buzzed hair matched his rigid authoritarian worldview. Tate had built a reputation in the terminal as a hardliner. He prided himself on his instincts, a thinly veiled excuse for the aggressive profiling that had earned him multiple quiet reprimands from human resources, none of which had ever stuck. Tate was currently nursing a bruised ego, having recently been passed over for a supervisory promotion. He was agitated, looking for a reason to assert his authority. As Tate scanned the incoming crowd, his eyes locked onto the Hale family. He watched as Julian confidently unhooked the velvet rope of the diplomatic lane and held it open for his wife and son. Tate's jaw tightened. In his mind, diplomats looked like European aristocrats or aging politicians. They didn't look like a black family with a teenager wearing a baggy hoodie. "Look at this guy," Tate muttered to a younger officer standing nearby. "Thinks he can just skip the whole line." The younger officer glanced up. "They're in the diplomatic lane. Probably got the credentials." "Yeah, we'll see about that," Tate scoffed, pushing off the podium. "We've been getting memos about fake VIP passports. I'm going to check this out." The younger officer started to protest, but Tate was already walking aggressively across the floor, intercepting the family just before they reached the designated diplomatic CBP booth. "Hold it right there," Tate barked, stepping directly into Julian's path, forcing the diplomat to stop abruptly to avoid a collision. Tate planted his feet, puffing out his chest, his hand resting casually but purposefully near his utility belt. "Where do you think you're going?" Julian looked at the officer, his expression shifting from travel-weary neutral to a mask of polite professionalism. "Good afternoon, officer. We are heading to the diplomatic screening desk." Are you? Tate's tone was dripping with condescension. He looked Julian up and down, then sneered at Caleb, who had pulled his headphones off and was watching the interaction with a frown. This lane is reserved for foreign diplomats and government officials, not for people who don't want to wait in line with everybody else. Back of the line is that way. Eleanor stepped up beside her husband. We are well aware of what this lane is for, officer. My husband is an ambassador. Tate let out a short, mocking laugh. An ambassador? Right. And I'm the King of England. Let me see your passports, now. Julian did not break eye contact. He knew exactly what this was. He had spent many years navigating international politics, and he recognized the petty tyranny of a small man with a badge. Slowly, deliberately, Julian reached into his breast pocket and produced 3 stiff red-covered booklets. They were not standard passports. They were United Nations diplomatic documents issued only to the highest-ranking international officials. Here you are, Julian said, handing them over. Tate snatched them. He didn't open them immediately. Instead, he flipped them over in his hands, feeling the covers, his eyes narrowing. These look fake. They are biometrically encoded United Nations diplomatic passports, Julian said, his voice lowering an octave, carrying the weight of a man accustomed to giving orders in rooms far more intimidating than a brightly lit airport terminal. If you take them to the scanner at the desk, your system will verify them in seconds. I don't need a machine to tell me when I'm looking at a forgery, Tate snapped, finally opening Julian's passport. He stared at the photograph, then at the ornate visas stamped inside. He looked back up at Julian, his frustration growing because the documents looked incredibly real. But Tate was too far in now. His ego wouldn't let him back down. Then Tate's eyes dropped to the heavy leather bag, securely tethered to Julian's wrist. What's in the bag? Tate demanded. That is a diplomatic pouch, Julian replied evenly. It contains sensitive communications and documents belonging to my government. Under the Vienna Convention, it is immune from search, seizure, or delay. Tate's eyes lit up. This was the excuse he needed. A sealed bag coming off an international flight. Yeah, that's not going to fly. I'm going to need you to step out of this line. We're going to secondary screening. The atmosphere around the diplomatic lane shifted instantly. A few nearby passengers in the regular queue had stopped shuffling forward, turning their heads to watch the confrontation. The younger officer, realizing the situation was escalating, hurried over. Hey, is everything all right here? Yeah, it's fine, Tate said loudly, making sure the surrounding crowd heard him. He wanted to embarrass the Hales. He wanted to put them in their place. We've got a suspected fraudulent entry and a refusal to submit to an agricultural and contraband search. Julian stood entirely motionless. Officer, he said, his voice piercingly calm and articulate. I am formally advising you that I am a credentialed diplomat. My family and I possess full diplomatic immunity under Title 22 of the United States Code. That bag is a recognized diplomatic pouch. If you detain us, you're violating international law. I suggest you call your port director immediately. Tate stepped forward, violating Julian's personal space. The height difference was negligible, but Julian's stoic posture made him seem a foot taller. You don't tell me what to do in my airport, Tate growled. You don't give the orders here. I do. And right now I'm ordering you to follow me to the secondary screening room. If you resist, I will place you under arrest for interfering with a federal officer. Do you understand me? Caleb shifted his weight, his fists clenching at his sides. Dad, this is ridiculous. He can't... Caleb. Silence, Eleanor said softly, placing a gloved hand on her son's arm. Her eyes never left Tate. Let the officer make his mistakes, darling. Tate sneered at her. Move now. Julian gave his wife a brief, almost imperceptible nod. Very well, officer. Lead the way. Tate turned, gesturing for the younger officer to take the rear, and began marching the Hale family through the terminal. They bypassed the customs booths entirely, walking down a long, sterile corridor lined with frosted glass windows. The walk felt intentional. A perp walk designed to humiliate. Tate held their red passports tightly in his left hand, swinging his arms aggressively. The younger officer walked a few paces behind the family, looking at the back of Julian's suit. He pulled out his handheld radio, quietly keying the microphone. "Dispatch, this is Officer Collins. Officer Tate is initiating a secondary screening on 3 individuals from the Geneva flight. Can you run a name for me? Pendleton? No, Hale. Julian Hale." Static crackled in his earpiece. "Copy that, Collins. Running it now." Tate led them to a heavy steel door, marked Secondary Inspections. He swiped his badge, and the door clicked open with a heavy mechanical thud. He pushed the door wide and pointed inside. Room 114 was a stark, windowless box. It smelled intensely of bleach and stale coffee. A stainless steel table sat in the center, bolted to the floor, surrounded by 4 cheap plastic chairs. A single security camera was mounted in the corner, staring down at them with a blinking red light. "Sit down," Tate ordered, tossing their passports onto the metal table. Julian did not sit. He walked to the center of the room and placed the leather diplomatic pouch on the steel table. The steel cable connecting the bag to his wrist clinked loudly in the quiet room. "I'm going to ask you one final time to call your supervisor," Julian said. "This is not a threat, officer. It is a professional courtesy. The moment you attempt to force me to open this bag, you will trigger a chain of events that you cannot stop, and for which you will be held entirely responsible." Tate slammed his hands down on the metal table, leaning across it until his face was inches from Julian's. "Listen to me very carefully. I don't care what kind of fancy fake ID you bought online. I don't care how many big words you use. You are in the United States now, and in this room you have no rights. I'm going to see what is in that bag." Elena, who had calmly taken a seat, smoothly reached into her trench coat pocket and pulled out her smartphone. "Hey, put that away," Tate barked. "No phones in the screening room. Hand it over." Eleanor ignored him entirely. Her thumbs flew across the screen with practiced precision. "I said give me the phone." Tate rounded the table, reaching for her. Before Tate could even take a second step, Julian moved. He didn't strike the officer, but he stepped directly into Tate's path, a solid, immovable wall of tailored wool and pure authority. "Do not touch my wife," Julian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous icy whisper. "Do not even think about it." Tate hesitated. For a fraction of a second, the bully in him faltered. There was something terrifyingly absolute in Julian's eyes. It wasn't the panic of a smuggler. It wasn't the bravado of a criminal. It was the absolute, unshakable confidence of a man who held true power. "I need backup to room 114. Tate barked into his shoulder radio, his voice betraying a hint of adrenaline. "I have non-compliant subjects, pliant." Within moments, the steel door opened again. 2 more CBP officers stepped into the room, their hands resting cautiously on their belts. One of them was an older, weary-looking supervisor named Elias Boone. "What's going on here, Tate?" Boone asked, taking in the scene. The well-dressed family, the metal table, and Tate looking red-faced and furious. "These individuals tried to bypass primary screening using forged UN credentials." Tate lied smoothly, pointing at the red passports on the table. "Subject is aggressive and is refusing to allow an inspection of a sealed bag attached to his person." Boone frowned, walking over to the table. He picked up one of the red diplomatic passports. He opened it, rubbed his thumb over the biometric chip, and held the watermarked pages up to the harsh fluorescent light. Boone's face went slightly pale. "Tate," Boone said quietly, "did you run these through the system?" "I don't need to," Tate scoffed. "Look at them and look at the bag. He won't let me X-ray it. Probably trafficking cash or narcotics. I'm going to cut it open." Tate reached into his pocket and pulled out a tactical folding knife. With a sharp flick of his wrist, the blade snapped open. "Stop right there," Boone commanded, stepping in front of Tate. "Put the knife away, Brad. Are you out of your mind?" "He's refusing a lawful search," Tate argued, his voice rising. Julian finally broke his silence. "Officer Boone, is it?" Boone turned to Julian, his demeanor instantly shifting to one of caution. "Yes, sir. My name is Dr. Julian Hale. I am the acting ambassador for the Caribbean Coalition to the United Nations. I am carrying a Class A diplomatic pouch containing classified trade agreements meant for the Secretary of State. Your officer here has illegally detained us, threatened my family, and is currently attempting to violate Article 27 of the Vienna Convention." Boone swallowed hard. He looked at the heavy leather bag, noting the thick, unbroken red wax seal of a sovereign government. He then looked at the steel cable binding it to Julian's wrist. "Sir, I apologize for the delay," Boone said, his voice trembling slightly. He turned to Tate, his eyes wide with panic. "Brad, step outside right now." "Are you kidding me, Boone?" Tate exploded. "He's playing you. He's playing all of us. Look at him. You think an ambassador walks around in a hoodie? They're mules. I'm doing my job." Tate lunged forward, pushing past Boone and grabbed the diplomatic pouch. "Hey!" Caleb yelled, stepping forward to protect his father. But Elena caught her son's arm, holding him back with surprising strength. "Let him do it," Eleanor said softly. She had just hit send on a text message. Tate grabbed the red wax seal with his left hand, raising the tactical knife in his right. "Officer Tate," Julian said, his voice echoing in the small room. "If that blade touches this bag, you will not just lose your badge. You will be indicted in federal court by the Department of Justice before the sun sets." Tate hesitated, the blade hovering an inch above the thick red wax. The absolute certainty in Julian's voice was unnerving. The room went dead silent, the tension so thick it felt like the air had been sucked out of the space. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a frantic pounding on the steel door. Before anyone could move, the door flew open, hitting the rubber wall stop with a violent crash. Standing in the doorway was the port director of the airport, Richard Lang. Lang was out of breath, his face completely drained of color, his suit jacket flapping open. Behind him stood two heavily armed federal agents in dark suits, earpieces curled behind their ears. Diplomatic Security Service. Lang's eyes frantically scanned the room, landing on Julian, then the red passports, and finally on Tate, who was standing over the diplomatic pouch with a drawn knife. "Tate!" Lang screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "Drop the knife! Drop it right now and step away from the ambassador." Tate froze. His brain struggled to process what was happening. The port director, the highest-ranking official in the airport, was standing in a secondary screening room, looking at him as if he were holding a live grenade. "Director Lang, I caught a smuggler," Tate stammered, his grip on the knife loosening. "He's got a fake—" "Shut your mouth!" Lang roared, stepping into the room. "Do not say another word. You are standing in front of Dr. Julian Hale, the UN envoy." Lang turned to the two DSS agents. "Disarm him, now!" The two federal agents moved with terrifying speed. Before Tate could even blink, one agent had seized his wrist, twisting it sharply to force him to drop the knife, which clattered loudly onto the steel table. The other agent shoved Tate forcefully against the concrete wall, pinning him there. "What are you doing?" Tate gasped, his face squished against the cold wall. "I'm CBP. I'm one of you." "Not anymore," Lang said, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and terror. Lang turned to Julian, visibly trembling as he smoothed his tie. "Ambassador Hale, I cannot begin to express my profound apologies. I received a direct call from the Undersecretary of State minutes ago. We had no idea you were being held." Julian looked at Lang, then slowly turned his gaze to Tate, who was currently pinned to the wall, his eyes wide, the horrifying reality of his catastrophic mistake finally crashing down upon him. Director Lang, Julian said smoothly, adjusting the cuffs of his suit jacket. It appears your officer needs a lesson in international diplomacy, and I have a schedule to keep. The DSS agents shoved Tate forward, marching the weeping, hyperventilating man out the steel door and down the corridor. He was no longer an officer of the law. He was a federal prisoner. His career, reputation, and freedom were extinguished in minutes. With Tate forcibly removed from the premises, the atmosphere in room 114 shifted from explosive tension to an awkward, suffocating deference. Director Lang, still pale and sweating, desperately tried to salvage whatever diplomatic goodwill remained. "Ambassador Hale, Madam Hale," Lang began, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of absolute submission. "A private motorcade provided by the State Department has just arrived on the tarmac. You will not have to walk back through the terminal. We will escort you directly to the vehicles." "That is acceptable," Julian said. He finally reached down and unlocked the heavy steel clasp that secured the leather diplomatic pouch to his wrist. He did not open the bag, simply shifting it to a more comfortable grip in his hand. Lang eyed the red wax seal, still perfectly intact. "Sir, if you don't mind my asking, just so I can fully articulate the scale of this near disaster to Washington, what exactly was Officer Tate moments away from cutting into?" Julian looked at Lang, calculating whether the port director had the clearance to know. Deciding that absolute terror was the best way to ensure this never happened again, Julian indulged him. "Inside this pouch, Director Lang, are the ratified counter-signatures for the Atlantic Green Energy Accord. It is a joint venture between the United States and 14 Caribbean sovereign states. It represents billions in infrastructure investments over the next decade. The treaty requires the physical seal of all participating nations to be deposited at the United Nations headquarters before the deadline. If that wax seal had been broken by an unauthorized entity, if your officer's knife had pierced this leather, the treaty would have been legally voided." Lang physically stumbled backward, leaning against the steel table for support. He realized that Harlan Tate hadn't just almost assaulted a diplomat. He had been seconds away from detonating a massive international geopolitical alliance. "Dear God," Lang whispered, the blood completely draining from his face. "Indeed," Julian replied coolly. "Shall we go?" The procession out of room 114 was the exact opposite of the humiliating perp walk Tate had subjected them to earlier. Director Lang led the way, practically clearing the path with his own body. Behind him walked Julian, Eleanor, and Caleb, flanked by the remaining officers, both of whom kept their eyes glued respectfully to the floor. They bypassed the crowded terminal corridors entirely, walking through a series of restricted access doors that led down into the concrete underbelly of the airport's tarmac operations. The heavy smell of jet fuel and warm asphalt filled the air. As the heavy blast doors opened to the outside, the fading afternoon sun hit them. Waiting on the restricted tarmac were 3 black armored Cadillac Escalades, their engines purring softly. A team of diplomatic security service agents in sharp dark suits stood by the vehicles. Standing near the lead SUV was a tall woman with graying hair and piercing blue eyes, Eleanor's former university roommate, now the United States Deputy Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs. Eleanor's face broke into its first genuine smile of the day. "Trish," the Deputy Secretary stepped forward, bypassing the security detail, and warmly embraced Eleanor. "Ellie, my God, are you all right? When I got your text, I nearly tore the roof off the building." "We are perfectly fine, Trish," Eleanor laughed softly, patting her friend's back. Julian handled it with his usual chilling restraint. The Deputy Secretary turned to Julian, extending her hand. "Mr. Ambassador, I am so incredibly sorry for this indignity. The Secretary of State sends his personal apologies. We have the DOJ drafting the indictment for the offending officer as we speak. He will be made an example of." Julian shook her hand firmly. "Thank you, Madam Secretary. It is unfortunate that systemic profiling still permeates the lower ranks of your border security. but I trust this incident will spark the necessary internal reviews. You have my absolute word on that, the deputy secretary said grimly, shooting a withering glare at Director Lang, who was standing a respectful distance away, looking like a man waiting for his own execution. Director Lang and I will be having a very long, very painful conversation about airport leadership tomorrow morning. The deputy secretary then looked at Caleb, who was standing by the SUV, looking incredibly impressed by the armada of federal agents buzzing around them. And Caleb, look how much you've grown. Still bound for Yale in the fall. Caleb grinned, his teenage apathy completely replaced by awe. Yes, ma'am, assuming I don't get arrested at the border again. The deputy secretary chuckled, though the sound was tight. I promise you, young man, your name is now flagged as absolute VIP status on every federal manifest in this country. No one will ever delay you again. The agents opened the heavy armor-plated doors of the Escalades. The Hale family climbed into the plush, quiet interior of the lead vehicle. Julian placed the diplomatic pouch gently on the leather seat beside him, the red wax seal catching the fading sunlight. As the motorcade began to roll forward, their tires humming against the concrete of the tarmac, Caleb looked out the tinted window. Far in the distance, near a chain-link security fence, he saw a standard blue CBP transport van. Being shoved into the back of it, his hands bound with plastic zip ties, his uniform stripped of its badges and insignias, was Harlan Tate. The man looked broken, his head hung low, a stark and pathetic silhouette against the massive jets taxiing behind him. Caleb watched until the van disappeared from view, then looked back at his father. Julian was calmly reviewing a document on his tablet, completely unbothered, as if the last hour had simply been a slight bump in the road. Dad, Caleb asked softly. Yes, Caleb, Julian replied without looking up from his screen. Did you know he was going to do that when you told him not to touch the bag? Did you know he'd try to force it? Julian finally looked up, closing the tablet. He looked at his son, his eyes softening just a fraction. Caleb, in my line of work, you learn to read men very quickly. Officer Tate is a man driven entirely by ego and prejudice. He saw what he wanted to see. He saw a target, not an equal. I simply gave him the rope, and his own arrogance tied the knot. Eleanor reached over, taking Julian's hand. It's a dangerous game to play, Julian. Perhaps, Julian agreed, looking out the window as the Manhattan skyline began to rise in the distance, a glittering monument to power and negotiation. But sometimes the only way to expose a rot in the system is to let it bring itself into the light. Officer Tate thought he was the most powerful man in that room. He just learned that true power never has to shout. The armored SUV merged onto the expressway, the diplomatic plates ensuring a clear path straight to the United Nations, leaving the ruined life of Harlan Tate far behind in the concrete labyrinth of the airport. Months later, the damp chill of lower Manhattan seeped through the heavy stone columns of the federal courthouse. The media circus outside was deafening. Satellite trucks lined the street and reporters clustered against the barricades holding microphones like weapons. The trial of the United States versus Harlan Tate had become a national spectacle, a lightning rod for debates on border security, systemic profiling, and diplomatic sovereignty. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was a suffocating vacuum of tension. Harlan Tate sat at the defense table, practically drowning in an ill-fitting gray suit. He had aged years in months. The arrogant, broad-shouldered bully who had strutted through the terminal was gone, replaced by a pale, twitchy man facing a very real, very terrifying prison sentence. His defense attorney, a notorious red-faced pit bull, had built a desperate, aggressive defense. His entire strategy relied on the good soldier narrative. He argued that Tate was a dedicated officer, reacting to vague Department of Homeland Security directives regarding fraudulent travel documents. The attorney was preparing to argue that Julian Hale had deliberately acted suspiciously to bait Tate into a trap, a political stunt designed to embarrass the agency. Seated at the prosecution table was an assistant United States attorney, a man whose quiet, meticulous nature made him a lethal prosecutor. He had built an ironclad case, but he knew the defense was going to try and muddy the waters. The courtroom fell dead silent as Judge Carolyn Foster, a no-nonsense jurist with decades on the federal bench, banged her gavel. "Counsel," Judge Foster said, her voice echoing in the mahogany-paneled room. "I have reviewed your motion to subpoena Ambassador Hale, demanding he testify regarding his suspicious demeanor on the day of the incident. The State Department has filed a motion to quash, citing absolute diplomatic immunity. They only need to submit a single piece of paper to make your motion vanish. The ambassador is untouchable in this court." The defense attorney stood up, adjusting his tie defensively. "Your Honor, the defense has a constitutional right to confront the accuser. If the ambassador refuses to testify, the jury will see this for what it is: a bureaucratic lynching of a working-class officer." Before Judge Foster could reprimand him for the outburst, the prosecutor stood up. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "the State Department did indeed prepare a motion to quash. However, I spoke with Dr. Hale this morning. He has elected to waive his immunity for the sole purpose of taking the witness stand today. He is waiting in the antechamber." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Tate's head snapped up, his eyes widening in sheer panic. The defense attorney's face lost its color. They had never actually expected the ambassador to show up. The subpoena was purely a theatrical ploy to create reasonable doubt. Now the trap they had set had just snapped shut on their own fingers. "Bring the ambassador in," Judge Foster ordered. The heavy oak doors opened and Julian Hale strode into the courtroom. He was dressed in a charcoal gray bespoke suit, his posture a masterclass in dignified authority. He did not look angry. He did not look nervous. He looked like a man walking into a boardroom to finalize a hostile takeover. Julian took the oath, sat in the witness box, and adjusted the microphone. His eyes briefly locked onto Tate, and in that fleeting second, Tate visibly shrank in his chair. The prosecutor walked to the podium. "Ambassador Hale, can you please state for the record what occurred when you presented your United Nations credentials to the defendant?" For the next hour, Julian recounted the events of that humid afternoon with chilling precision. He didn't embellish. He didn't need to. The raw facts were devastating enough. He described the aggressive posturing, the dismissal of the biometric passports, the unlawful detention, and the drawn tactical knife. The defense attorney practically leapt out of his chair. For cross-examination, he strutted toward the witness stand, trying to reclaim control of the room. "Dr. Hale," he began, his tone dripping with skepticism, "you are an expert in international law, are you not? You knew that if you simply opened that bag for 5 seconds, Officer Tate would have let you go. Instead, you chose to escalate the situation. Isn't it true you deliberately provoked my client to make a political point about racial profiling?" Julian looked at the defense attorney with a mixture of pity and absolute disdain. "Counselor," Julian replied, his voice calm yet carrying to the furthest corners of the gallery, "I am an envoy of a sovereign coalition. That pouch contained the countersigned Atlantic Green Energy Accord, a multi-billion-dollar treaty. Under the Vienna Convention, if I had voluntarily opened that bag for an unauthorized foreign agent, I would have been committing treason against my own government. I didn't escalate the situation. I merely refused to break international law to coddle your client's fragile ego." The defense attorney swallowed hard. "But you must admit room 114 has no audio recording, it's just a silent security feed. You claim my client threatened you, but we only have your word on what was actually said in that room." The prosecutor stood up. "Objection, Your Honor, and if it pleases the court, The prosecution would like to introduce Exhibit 42 into evidence at this time. What is Exhibit 42? Judge Foster asked. It is an audio file, Your Honor, the prosecutor said, a slight victorious smirk playing on his lips. Mr. Tate is correct that CBP's camera in room 114 does not record sound. However, when the defendant attempted to illegally confiscate Mrs. Eleanor Hale's mobile phone, she had already initiated a call to the Deputy Secretary of State. The call went to secure voicemail. The State Department's Diplomatic Security Service cyber forensics team was able to retrieve the voicemail recording from their encrypted servers. Tate let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He buried his face in his hands. "Play the audio," Judge Foster commanded. The prosecutor pressed a button on his laptop. The courtroom speakers crackled, and suddenly, Harlan Tate's voice boomed through the room, dripping with malice and unfiltered arrogance. "I don't care what kind of fancy fake ID you bought online. You are in the United States now, and in this room you have no rights. I'm going to see what is in that bag." The recording captured the heavy clink of the steel cable, Julian's calm warnings, and finally the terrifying, distinct metallic click of the tactical knife locking into place. "He's playing you. He's playing all of us. Look at him. You think an ambassador walks around in a hoodie? They're mules. I'm doing my job." The audio ended with the chaotic crash of Director Lang bursting into the room. The silence that followed in the courtroom was absolute. The defense attorney slowly walked back to the defense table and sat down, refusing to look at his client. The defense was fundamentally destroyed. "No further questions, Your Honor," the defense attorney mumbled. Judge Foster looked down at Tate. "The jury is dismissed for deliberation, although, frankly, I doubt they will need long." They didn't. It took the jury a short time to return a verdict of guilty on all counts, including felony assault of a foreign official and unlawful imprisonment. When it came time for sentencing, Judge Foster did not hold back. "Harlan Tate, you were given a badge to protect the borders of this nation. Instead, you used it as a shield to enact your own petty prejudiced tyrannies. You humiliated this country on the global stage, and you nearly detonated a critical international treaty because you could not fathom that a black family possessed more authority than you. You are a disgrace to the uniform you wore." She brought the gavel down with a resounding crack. "I sentence you to 8 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole." The conviction of Harlan Tate sent shockwaves through the entire Department of Homeland Security. It was a brutal wake-up call that forced an immediate top-down reckoning within the agency. At the airport's terminal, the fallout was swift and merciless. Port Director Richard Lang, whose catastrophic lack of oversight had allowed a rogue officer like Tate to operate unchecked for years, was quietly forced into early retirement. He was replaced by a brilliant, ruthless former federal prosecutor. Her first act as port director was to completely dismantle the secondary screening protocols. Under her mandate, a new standard operating procedure was codified internally, dubbed the Hale Protocol. It mandated that any traveler presenting diplomatic credentials must have those credentials biometrically verified by a supervisory officer at primary screening. Secondary screening of any credentialed diplomat now required the direct real-time authorization of the State Department's duty officer. No single CBP agent would ever again have the unilateral authority to detain a foreign dignitary based on instinct. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, in a climate-controlled vault, deep beneath the United Nations Secretariat building, the Atlantic Green Energy Accord was officially deposited. It had been ratified on schedule, averting a crisis that would have derailed a decade of international diplomacy. On a crisp Friday afternoon, Julian Hale stood near the massive glass windows of the UN Delegates' Lounge, looking out over the churning gray waters of the East River. He held a crystal glass of sparkling water, his demeanor as calm and immovable as ever. Eleanor approached him, slipping her arm gracefully through his. She looked out at the water, resting her head lightly against his shoulder. "I spoke with Trish this morning," she murmured. "She says the DHS Internal Affairs Division is doing a full audit of every port of entry in the Northeast. They've already dismissed a dozen officers with histories of unwarranted detentions." Julian took a slow sip of his water. "Systemic rot requires a violent extraction, Eleanor. Tate was merely the symptom. The disease was the culture that allowed him to thrive. Now, they know we are watching." "And what about Caleb?" Eleanor asked, a warm, proud smile touching her lips. Julian's eyes softened as he looked back into the lounge. Sitting at a corner table surrounded by thick textbooks and a glowing laptop was their son. Caleb was no longer wearing the oversized vintage hoodie. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored tweed blazer and a crisp white shirt. He had just finished his freshman midterms at Yale University, and his academic trajectory had taken a sharp turn. He had abandoned his plans to study architecture. Instead, he was deeply immersed in pre-law and international relations. Caleb had watched his father dismantle an armed, abusive federal officer using nothing but the law, absolute composure, and an unbreakable understanding of his own rights. It had fundamentally altered the young man's worldview. He didn't want to build buildings anymore. He wanted to build the invisible frameworks that held the world together and held corrupt men accountable. "Caleb is exactly where he needs to be," Julian said quietly. "He learned the most important lesson a man in our position can learn. The loudest voice in the room is usually the weakest. True power is precision." 80 miles north, in the cold gray confines of a federal correctional institution, the loud metallic clang of a cell door echoing down the block signaled the start of evening lockdown. Harlan Tate sat on a thin, uncomfortable mattress, staring blankly at the cinder block wall. His gray prison uniform hung loosely on his shrinking frame. He was completely isolated. Former law enforcement officers were kept in protective custody, despised by the general population, and abandoned by their former colleagues. On the small, static-filled television mounted behind thick plexiglass at the end of the cell block, the evening news was playing. The volume was low, but Tate's eyes drifted toward the screen. The broadcast showed the floor of the United Nations General Assembly. The camera panned across the massive hall, settling on the podium. Standing there, bathed in the flashing lights of hundreds of international press cameras, was Dr. Julian Hale. Tate watched as the ambassador smiled, shook hands with the Secretary General, and held up a thick leather-bound folio containing the newly enacted global treaty. The crowd erupted into a standing ovation. Julian looked immaculate, powerful, and completely untouchable. Tate lowered his head, staring at the scarred concrete floor of his cell. In the quiet, suffocating isolation of his confinement, the memory of his own voice from the courtroom recording echoed mockingly in his ears. "You are in the United States now, and in this room, you have no rights." He squeezed his eyes shut as a single bitter tear traced a line down his cheek. Harlan Tate had spent his entire life judging books by their covers, abusing his authority to punish those he deemed beneath him. Now, he would spend the next 8 years of his life in a small cell, fully aware that the man he had tried to destroy had not only beaten him, but hadn't even had to raise his voice to do it. If you were captivated by this true-to-life story of power, justice, and the ultimate diplomatic takedown, you won't want to miss our next video. We dive deep into real stories where arrogance meets absolute authority, and corrupt individuals get exactly what they deserve. Did Harlan Tate's sentence satisfy justice, or should the entire system face a harsher penalty? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Don't forget to hit that like button. Share this incredible story with your friends. And subscribe to the channel for more jaw-dropping real-life drama.